So I get this question a lot of, what's the difference between sharps, creases, bevels, and support loops, and when should I use them and when shouldn't I use them? So let's try to figure that out with this. And we'll start out with these basic examples and then we'll work our way up to practical modeling examples. So for starters here, we have sharps, and sharps have absolutely no place in subdivision hard surface modeling because they actually define mesh normals. They don't define anything on the actual geometry. So as you can see here, these sharps are doing nothing apart from revealing all the faceting on our subdivided cube here. So you'd use sharps if you were baking normals on a low poly mesh, or if you were using a weighted normals modeling workflow. But when it comes to subdivision, sharps have no place. Next we have creases, and creases are really handy because they define how tight an edge is on your subdivided model without adding any additional topology. So as you can see, as it tends towards 0, we get a perfect sphere, and then as we start to increase it, notice how the edges get a little bit rounder, a little bit tighter as it tends towards 1, until we get an infinitely sharp edge. And I think it's a little bit easier to see this with this little shader here. So if we take this all the way down to 0, we get perfect blue across the entirety of the sphere. And then if we start to increase the intensity of the creases, notice you start to see that influence appear on the shader there, right up until it hits 1, where you're getting, once again, an infinitely sharp edge at red. So the benefit to creases is that you don't need to add any additional topology to your mesh. You can just tell Blender, hey, just tighten up these edges with the existing subdivided topology. So next we have bevels, and I don't think the cubes do a great job of illustrating why you'd use bevels over creases or creases over bevels, but when we get into the actual proper modeling examples, I think it will make this a little bit more clear. But bevels are more so used for defining the profile or shape of an edge. So if I just turn off the smooth shading in the subdiv here and bring this back down to one segment, notice how we're getting this nice flat straight edge along the edges now, and then as we start to bring it up to something else, we get a nice rounded edge. We'd start to define the profile of things a little bit more. And you'll find that I keep on mentioning the fact that these are used for profiles as opposed to holding edges like creases, but as I said, that will become more apparent when we get to the actual modeling examples. And then finally, we have support loops, and keep that name in mind because it's named that for a very particular reason, and we'll get into that later on. But if I go ahead, Control R, cut in a support loop down the bottom here, one along the front, and just bring these closer to the edges, notice how we start to harden up the edges a bit. So this works very similarly to creases, but it means we actually need to add in more geometry to our mesh, which can be a little bit harder to manage sometimes. And then to not confuse you, but to just show you some utility here, bevels can also be used as support loops. So if we go ahead, Control B on this model, and I've already got it set up here, but the profile shape is normally just set to 0.5, right? And if we bring this segments up from 1 to 2, and change this shape profile from 0.5 to 1, it's effectively the same as just going around and adding in the support loops, much like we were doing over here, right? So when you kind of change the profile to 1, such as we've done here, and sorry, I'll chuck in this subdiv so that it's actually visible to what it's doing. When you change that profile shape to 1, I no longer really consider it a bevel, it does just become a support loop. That's just a bit of utility for how you can also purpose bevels to create support loops. So let's get into some actual examples here. And so I've got this Nightfall helmet here that I made a while ago, and I use predominantly creases across the entirety of this model. But let's try to show why I wouldn't want to use support loops on this model. So let's just go ahead, I'm just going to select this edge along here. And I'm just going to go Shift A, -1 to remove it. And now you can see that's really just washed out that edge. So let's try to use support loops to harden this up again. And what we know about support loops is that we cut one on the right-hand side, bring that in, tighten it up a bit. And we cut another one on the left-hand side and bring that in a bit. And then if we look at this, that edge is nicely hardened up again. It's a nice hard edge. But notice at the back here, it kind of falls apart. And it's pretty good down the bottom here at the front. But notice how we're getting this crease appearing through the model. You can see it at the front and you can see it at the back here as well. And if we just bring in a bit of a harsher matte cap, you can really see the effect that it's having, right? And so the logical argument is to say, well, just go ahead and just ease it out where it doesn't need to be having as much effect. And you're totally correct. We could double tap G and we could just slide this out a bit. And we could do the same over here. Just double tap G and slide this out. But we're still getting a problem at the front here because this does flow down into a curve here. And then the next thing is to say, well, go ahead and do what I always advocate for and do a good old space and relax, right? And that does work. The only problem is that's taken so much work, right, to just get one simple edge hardened up. So imagine if we did it for all the rest of these here. And then even when we start to look at this with a bit of a harsher matte cap, you can see we've introduced some distortions along the front here that were never there. And it also means we'd need to go and do that exact same process at the back there as well. So I find that when it comes to more complicated models, such as helmets or something where you've got an edge that sort of bleeds into several different edges or shapes or curves or something of the sorts, then creases are going to be your best friend. But I did also mention the fact that we can add in support loops by using Control B and changing the bevel profile, right? So let's try to do that here as well to be fair and equitable to all the different modeling approaches. I'm not going to be able to cover absolutely everything in this, but I'll do my best to just make a basis for where we can and can't use particular modeling methods. So let's just go ahead. I'm just going to do this a little bit more comprehensively. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove the creasing on all of these. And then let's use that Control B to bevel these. So Control B will bevel. And then let's just turn our overlays off. And for the most part, that looks really nice, doesn't it? Like, that's almost the same effect that we had when we're doing our creasing. But if you notice, when we get to corners, it gets a little bit more convoluted, like, because this is causing a lot of pinching, and then it's especially worse at the front here, right? Like, this is just an absolute nightmare. So, as I said, when it comes to more complicated shapes like a helmet here, I don't really recommend that we use solely support loops to harden up our edges. We can use support loops, but it's more in tandem with creases. And let's illustrate that point of how you use creases and support loops together. And I think this little module on the side here is a good example of that. So we've got this creased edge at the front here, right? But if I just go ahead and remove this support loop, and then we have a look at it, notice that it doesn't look right anymore. It's become really soft, and instead of this being a perfectly straight edge, now it kind of warps in at the very end, which doesn't look right. And we can understand why this is happening if we turn our wireframe on here. Notice how on the left-hand side here, all these faces are really nice and small, and like their average size, I don't know why my grease pencil keeps on doing that, their average size is all very consistent with one another. But then we look on the right-hand side here, and all these faces are really stretched out and elongated. So when Blender's coming to decide how to shade this edge here, it's trying to take the average of all these faces on the left-hand side here, and all the faces on the right-hand side here, and trying to average those out to create that edge. And that's why we're getting this weird, distorted sort of look here. So what we do when we add in a support loop is we fundamentally support that edge, right? And you'll notice as I start to drag this in closer to the creased edge, we start to make that average between the right-hand side and the left-hand side faces a lot more even. So now Blender can more reliably average out the shading for this edge because everything is fairly even. We don't need to worry about all these faces out here because they aren't influencing this edge since we've got this support loop here. So you don't use creases just as a standalone, you also do need to use them with support loops because support loops act to support other edges, thus the name, right? I've just made a compelling argument to say, hey, creases are better than support loops and you only use support loops to support crease. Not always the case. So I've modeled this little thing here, it's very basic, but I've just noticed on like the front of car hoods, they kind of had like these little peaked points that come to a like triangular sort of shape. Anyway, so just very basically tried to replicate that. So let's use my logic and let's go ahead and crease up all the hard edges here, right? So Shift E 0.55. And for the most part, that looks fine. You know, we've got 3 hard edges here that all come to a point. But notice this like weird sort of bulge and pinching at the front here, and it becomes especially apparent when we use a much harsher matte cap. The shading just looks awful. Notice how it's breaking up as we're looking straight down on it. It doesn't look right, does it? It doesn't look anything like that reference image I just chucked up. So let's just make a duplicate of this and we'll just set the creased version aside and we'll remove all the creases here. So in this instance, I'd highly advocate for the fact that we use support loops, even though I just made a massive spiel about how good creases are, right? So what I want to do first is I'd want to cut in a support loop along the front here, but you'll notice I can't get one to connect, and that's because of these triangles in the middle. So what I can do instead is I can subdivide, oops, not space, Subdivide all of these edges here. Now we've got a connected edge. And I can just grab these middle two edges. I don't want to select the outer ones because I don't want to muck around with the curvature. Double tap G to do an edge slide and just bring these in to just start to sharpen up the front. And now you'll notice we're getting much nicer shading. So it's kind of brought this to a bit of a peak, but we're getting much nicer shading as it falls off. You're always going to get a little bit of pinching with a design like this. That's just inevitable, but it looks infinitely nicer, right? But I hear you saying, it's like, well, that's cool, but look at the back of it. There's no proper hard edges at the back there, like with the creased version. And you're spot on, but we still can actually use some support loops to help with this issue. So let's go ahead, we'll go Control R, cut in a loop here, double tap G, and we'll just slide this up. And we'll do the same on the other side. Double tap G, slide this one up. And so now we've got that nice peak at the top here. But we're still missing these creases down on the bottom. So we can still use support loops here as well. So we'll go Control R. I'm just going to select these two edges at the back here. Double tap G, E, and F to conform to the edge. Slide that in to tighten that up. And then I'll do the same on the other side. Double tap G and slide that in. And there we go. Now we've pretty much got the exact same result as with the creases, but something that shades a lot nicer. Now, what's actually going on here? Why is this different? Well, remember how we defined what a crease does? It doesn't actually add in any additional topology, right? It's just telling Blender, hey, try to harden up this edge using the subdivided topology that we already have, right? So if we enable our wireframe here, you can see a drastic difference between the way these are resolving. Obviously, the one with support loops is a lot denser around the edges because we added more topology, whereas the one with creases is perfectly uniform because we're just using creases. But notice a distinction here along the front. Notice how all these edges are very straight as it leads up into this little peak here, right? It doesn't really respect the fact that anything changes in the distribution of the shape of the model, right? Whereas if we look at this one here with the support loops, notice how gradually before it reaches this peak, the topology is more accurately respecting that shape and design, and we get a more natural fall off. So am I going to be able to tell you a clear-cut definition for, hey, use creases here and use support loops here? Unfortunately, no. Something with modeling is that it's very much a trial and error kind of approach to problem solving. And the best thing I can say is if you use support loops for something and it doesn't work and it causes issues, like on the Nightfall example, well, then try using creases and vice versa. So it's unlikely that you'll go into every single modeling problem knowing the exact way to solve it without doing a little bit of trial and error first. So unfortunately, I'm not going to give you a silver bullet here, but in most examples where you have a curved surface and you have this sort of peaked design flowing into it, I can reliably say that you will want to use support loops over creases. So let's get into bevels now. And as I said at the start, bevels are more so for defining the shape of a profile of an edge as opposed to holding edges like creases or support loops do. And I think a great example of this is this SMG stock that I modeled a while ago. And I find it rather interesting because, you know, we've got a bevel along the side here, we've got a bevel along the back, and then we've got like this little internal bevel profile shape here as well. And you'd be absolutely mad to go through and try to manually place all of those verts to get that design. So naturally you would use a bevel, right? You wouldn't want to try to use a crease to, you know, use a very low value crease to round that out because it's just not going to look good. So you'd use a bevel. Makes sense. So let's just basically illustrate this. This takes a lot more work than what I'm about to do here to get this design, but it still proves the point. So let's go Control B and we'll just bevel this out. I've still got that profile set to 1, so we just need to bring that down to 0.5 again. And we can just bump up these segments so that we're getting a nice rounded edge there. And then we can go ahead and do the same for the bottom. So I'm just going to drag this up a bit, Control B. And, you know, now we've roughly matched that profile shape of those edges there. But we've also got this little interesting design in the middle here as well. And we can also use bevels to address this. So I'm just going to use my knife tool here. So K, C, and Z to cut a straight line and cut it through the mesh. And then I'll just cut this straight down. And so what we can do here is we can just select this vertex up in the top, Control Shift and B to bevel a vertex, and we can just drag that out. And now we've roughly got that design going. And then there's two more bevels that we want to do here. So we want a bevel on these outer edges to round these out, so Control B. And I'm just going to press C to enable clamping so that it doesn't clip through our mesh there. So I'm just going to go with that. And as I said, you need to do more work on this to get the actual shape because these bevels are a lot larger. And then the final bevel that we can do is because we've kind of got like this panel line indent here. So what we can do, I'm just going to hide the actual model, is with this edge selected, we can go Control B once more. And I'm just going to bring this down to one segment. And what we can do is we can just select that inner part of the bevel, use Alt and S, and just push that in. And that's a really easy way to make a panel cut line, right? So hopefully that starts to prove the point of bevels are more of a tool or a means of utility to define the profile of an edge as opposed to using it similar to the way we use creases or support loops to hold an edge. It's defining a profile instead, right? And I think that becomes really apparent with something like this Space Marine faceplate here. And if you followed along with the tutorial series, you'll be well aware of what I'm about to describe here. But at the front here, we don't actually use creases. We use bevel weights to define the outer edge of these vents here. And it is because we need to define a specific profile shape to these edges. So I can go ahead and I can remove these bevels here. And let's try to replicate this design, which looks really nice on all these other vents, with creases. So let's go Shift E, and we can start to crease it up, not too much. So somewhere around there. So we've got a low-level crease here, but it just doesn't look right. It just looks like we've got a soft edge, and it doesn't look like we know what we're doing, because it's like, well, is it a hard edge or isn't it? And so bevels just give us the profile that we actually need here, right? Because we need more of that rounded design, and creases just aren't going to fulfill that. So hopefully you can start to see where and why we want to use bevels over creases, because all these really minuscule hard edges on the model, right, it's fine to use a crease because we just need to hard it up. But these ones here, where it's got a little bit more shape and design to the profile of the edge, we want to use a bevel. And a really pertinent example of why I wouldn't want to use bevels for holding edges is on these models here. So I'm just going to quickly scroll around these and see if you can figure out which one is wrong. And frankly, I think it's pretty glaringly obvious, especially around this angle. But it's the top version of the model here, right? And this is using bevels as holding edges. And as we get a little bit closer, you can see there's a lot more errors here. There's a whole lot of red, which means we've got back-facing pulling through. And so the argument for this is to say, well, you know, what are you doing here? You're using a bevel weight of 1 for every edge. That's unreasonable. You know, use different bevel weights for each edge. And that's fair. We can go through and we can start to reduce these to try to clean up the model. But keep in mind, this is just one forearm that's a part of a much larger suit of armor. So to meticulously go through and correct however many errors there are on this model would take so long. So then the other reasonable argument is to say, well, you know, okay, don't do that. Just clamp the overlap and then you don't need to worry about it. And that does technically fix the issue. But notice how hard these edges are now. We might as well not even have a bevel on this thing because it just looks like they are perfectly sharp edges. And especially in comparison to the model below it, which is using subdivision and creases, you're getting much nicer hard edges on the model. And you don't need to worry about meticulously going through and setting different crease values for everything, because all the crease values here are using 0.5. So I can worry more about the modeling as opposed to frantically going around and adjusting a million different mean bevel weights, right? So I'm making a massive case for saying, hey, do not use bevels as holding edges. But I want to make a counterpoint to my own argument with these visors here. So if you've done the recon modeling tutorial, once again, you'll be familiar with what I'm about to explain here. But just look at these two models and see if you can figure out which one is problematic or which one has got an error with it, right? And if you can't see it, it's the one on the right here. And the glaring giveaway is these, once again, back-facing faces that are pulling through. And funnily enough, despite everything I've said about creases and subdiv, this is using creases and subdivs, and it just doesn't work that nicely. You know, obviously we could go through and we could try to fix these edges up by, you know, creasing the outer edges, and it starts to look better, but we just can't avoid this pinching that we get and this warping and distortion we get on the visor. So in this instance, it's much better to actually use bevels as a holding edge. And you might make the argument of, well, hang on, you just said don't use really small bevel weights on something because you might as well use sharps. And once again, you are 100% correct, but let's just look at this if it did have sharps, right? So let's turn the bevel off and keep sharps. Notice how polygonal this looks. It looks obviously fake. It looks like a 3D model all of a sudden. So on something like a visor or something that's really reflective where you don't want to see a bunch of distortions in the model, I'd say 100% use bevels as a holding edge. Or in a different instance, if you're modeling something that's very mechanical and blocky, then use bevels as a holding edge over sub-D modeling because it's just going to make your life infinitely easier. You want to use creases and sub-D when you're doing more organic hard surface modeling shapes like helmets or armor or something of the sorts. So I've shown you how we can use creases to define hard edges, how we can use creases and support loops, how we can use support loops, how not to use support loops, how not to use creases, and how we can use creases and bevels alongside one another. And at the end of the day, I'd say do not try to limit yourself and restrict yourself to just saying that you need to use creases or only bevels or only support loops when you model. Use a bit of everything. It's all circumstantial to what's going to be the best outcome for your model. And I've been doing this for over 10 years now, and as you can see, I quite like modeling sci-fi helmets. And I'd say the strongest tool in my modeling kit is 100% creases. It just seems to work the best. It doesn't require me to go ahead and add in a bunch more topology to everything. I can just model the basic shapes, add creases, and it looks nice. And there is no exact formulaic way of modeling things. You know, I've said use bevels if you're doing something like a visor that's really shiny and reflective, but there are instances, like on the Nightfall, where I just found that creases worked equally as well. So it's really circumstantial. Don't go into everything believing that you have to do it in one particular way. Modeling is all about a little bit of trial and error and seeing what works best. So experiment with using creases or support loops or bevels and see what's going to work best for you. So I hope this has been able to shine some light on how and why you should or shouldn't use creases, or how or why you should or shouldn't use bevels or support loops, and why you definitely shouldn't use sharps in subdivision hard surface modeling. So I hope this has been informative for you guys. I hope this has shined some light on how to model with these different tools. And if you have any more questions, please just reach out, ask me down in the comments, and I'll be more than happy to answer them for you. With that out of the way, I'll see you guys all in the next tutorial.